Okay, let's look at floats in the browser. When we float an element, it gets removed from the standard flow. So the standard flow is how the browser lays things out. When the element that's floated gets removed from the flow, a couple things happened. So one is that any text that's nearby the element will start to wrap around it. And the second is that any block level elements that come after the floated element in our HTML will actually go up behind the floated element as though it doesn't exist. The primary purpose of float is to sort of wrap text around images and boxes and stuff like that. But we can use it for much more complex tasks like creating columns and things like that. So if we look at my HTML here, I just have a div and a paragraph. And in my CSS, you can see my paragraph just has a background color and a border, and my div just has a background color and a padding. So right now, my layout looks like this. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to float the div so you can see what happens. So inside my div here, I'm going to write float left, like that. So look what's happening now. You can see that the text here is wrapping around my floated div, and you can also see that the paragraph box is in behind the floated div. So the block level elements are sort of ignoring that there's something floated there, but the text level elements, the text-like elements, are sort of wrapping around my float. Now, the cool thing about floats is the major thing that we use for floats is that we can wrap text around it. So you can see my text is really tight here. If I wanted to make some adjustments, I'd just put the margin, change the margin on my div here, let's say 0.5 em, and we can sort of create text that wraps around our floated element. Now let's look at another thing here. I'm going to go to my HTML and I'm going to make a second paragraph. So I now have two paragraphs here. Looks like this. And then I'm going to put a bunch more text into my div. Let's just put the word floated a bunch of times. Okay, let's see how that looks in the browser. So that looks like that, okay? So one thing about floats is by default, just like an inline level element, they only take up as much space as they need, or they can extend out as long as they need to fill the amount of content. So right here, you can see that my floated element is going wide because I have all this extra content in it. So let's go to my CSS and let's just put a width on it, say 5 em, see how that looks. There we go. So now we have two paragraphs and we have this floated box here, and you can see both of those paragraphs are behind the floated box. But what if I wanted this second paragraph to start down here, so underneath the floated thing? And that's where clear comes in. So clear is kind of the companion to float. Float allows us to wrap things, and then clear allows us to force elements to be visually below things that have been floated. So let's go back to my HTML here, and I'm going to put a class on my second P. Class equals second P. I'll just call it that because that's fun. All right, so I'm going to target second P. Second P. All right, and I want it to go underneath the things that are floated, so I'm going to write clear both. All right, so there we go. So now it's forced underneath the floated item. When we're talking about clear, clear actually has a bunch of different values. So I use clear both, and that means that it will go underneath things that are floated left and things that are floated right. But the other options are we could write clear left or we could write clear right. And in those situations, that would mean that we would clear only the things that are floated left or clear only the things that are floated right. And one thing I did mention is float only has really two values, float left or float right. The other value is float none, which is what things are in by default in order to shut off the floating. All right, so that is essentially what Float is. It allows us to sort of wrap text and sort of move boxes around on the screen. Move them independent of the sort of standard flow of our website.